had the privilege of taking the first train around on opening day. Dennis Larry. Come on up, Dennis. And before I hand the mic to Dennis, I'm going to ask something of everybody. If you're going to have any conversations with people at your table while we have the speakers, we're going to ask you to take it out by the trees out there because people want to listen to what people have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. What a great opportunity to come back and share from 50 years ago. How'd you like the tour of the steam engine this morning? First of all, I'm going to start off by saying I'm one of you. I used to be a member of ACE, and I managed to crack a rib on the Woody down in Louisville. And as you well know, the pain was well worth it. And I also would like to say, if anyone knows who designs the seats for Vietnam, please thank them for me. Because I'm now 71 years old and I worry about my back, and those coaster seats on the Vietnams are fantastic. Okay, anyone know what happened on June the 18th, 1960? 61,500 people showed up for the opening of Freedom Land USA in New York because Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood had oversold the park and he had to close the gates at 2 o'clock that day. It was a PR disaster. So that's probably when parks decided they needed to have soft openings. Kings Island had a soft opening. If I remember my numbers right from 50 years ago, please don't quote me, I'm remembering this, I think we had 4,000 people. If you didn't walk through that gate as a couple, you probably didn't see anyone else the rest of the day. It was a cold, miserable, misty day. The type of cold that goes right through your bones. And I remember our ride supervisor saying, well, I guess we're open. And I just wanted to shout, dude, how can you not be excited about this? So we took the first train out, and we had 6 crew members and 4 passengers on the first run. Not very economic. But we should have been happy about that cold mist because 4 hours later it turned into a downpour. So Kings Island had one of the smallest and shortest openings in history. But we consoled ourselves and said, well, these are just the preview weekends. We know we'll be better in June when we go full time. And we were. We averaged 8,000 people. I think they told us we had to have 11,000 just to break even, and we were averaging 8,000. And the people downtown were just getting a little bit nervous. There were nights I would sit on the locomotive in the station and not see one guest walk through Rivertown for an hour. It was that bad. But something happened on July 4th. The track used to run along the front fence, and when we came back to the park, we could see way off in this distance the thing they called the parking lot. And that morning, the parking lot seemed closer. And it kept getting closer and closer and closer until there were cars parking on grass that had never seen cars before. And that night, at 9 o'clock, we were still running a full train. The deal back then was, on weekends, on Saturdays, and on holidays, we would close at 11 o'clock. Not just the gate, but the actual rides. And at a quarter to 11 that night, they made an announcement and said, ladies and gentlemen, due to the excellent crowds, tonight Kings Island will stay open till midnight. And there was this huge crowd roar across the park. But what you were really hearing were the people downtown going, whoo, we dodged a bullet there. Well, we got to midnight, and guess what happened? They made another announcement and said, ladies and gentlemen, we're staying open till 1 a.m. And we did. We did. I got out of there about 2 o'clock in the morning that day. And as you may know, the rest is history because we were the first regional park that ever hit 2 million people in 1 year. And you got to think about what the park was back then. Disneyland and Kings Island were the same size when they opened, 69 acres. But Walt Disney ran his train around the park, whereas here we dedicated 22 acres to just the train, plus 8 acres for this picnic ground. So Kings Island was effectively about 40 acres. So it was a very, very small park, and we were the first to hit 2 million in 1 year in our very first year. So I'm very, very proud of this place. I still am. Let's talk about the steam train for a moment. Back in the 1950s, there was a guy that owned a company that made pot scrubbers, the things you used to scrub your skillet with. And he bought a little keggy locomotive out of an amusement park, and he restored it and got it running. And another fellow came along and said, could you build one of those for me? Well, the bottom line is, 30 years later, he and his son had built 109 locomotives brakes, and around 500 cars. That's a pretty good family hobby. Out of those 109, over 100 of them were working steam engines, but a few were diesels. 2 of the diesels went to Canada's Wonderland where they were never even used. CW didn't build their Frontier Canada area for almost 20 years, so those trains never got used up there. Out of the 100 engines that are steam, 21 of them were the size of Kings Islands. The rest were smaller ones, like you see the Chance Morgan trains and most small parts. But 21 of them were the size of Kings Islands. One of those went to Germany, where it's still running. One of them went to Kuwait, where it disappeared during the First Gulf War, and we think that Saddam's troops stole it and took it to Baghdad as a present for Saddam Hussein, but we don't know because we can't find it. And there was a third one that was bought secondhand by a guy by the name of Michael Jackson for his Neverland Ranch. Now, there's one thing I want to clear up about our trains. They are not scale models, even though they'll tell you that. Back in the 1870s, there was a thing going around the country called narrow gauge fever. Small towns were building smaller trains that ran on 3-foot wide track instead of 4-foot 8.5-inch wide track. It was just an economical thing to do that. You could run on smaller trestles and tighter curves. So our trains are actually what you call full-size narrow gauge. In the 1870s, Cincinnati was known as the narrow gauge capital of the world because we had 5 narrow gauge railroads, and we hosted the National Narrow Gauge Convention twice. The first train that ran from Cincinnati to Mason over here was pulled by a locomotive that was exactly the same size as our trains. So they are full-size trains. The only difference in the technology is they're welded together instead of riveted. They burn propane for obvious reasons, and they have air brakes, which were not invented until 1869. But the trains weigh about 110 tons, fully loaded, so it's kind of nice to have brakes coming down the hill. When we opened the ride, we had a PA system on the station platform to tell people what they would see later in the year, because it was just a mud hole back there. It was a lousy spring, and they were way behind getting things in, and there was no animation whatsoever. But they had 2 bare settler cabins built out there, and one Saturday morning during the preview weekends, we managed to come by the cabins, and suddenly there were mannequins in front of those cabins. Naked mannequins. Naked mannequins that someone had painted on details. And it didn't take too long before we started hearing about it from parents. So they sent this little redhead kid out there with a bunch of sheets and safety pins. And as we came by, he had them all covered up, except he didn't have the pins in quite yet. And the wind came up, and that was the first live entertainment on the train. As time went on, we had a shoddy landing. It was a 10-person canoe back behind us there, and you had 2 people that were rowing and giving the spiel, and you had 8 people that were the passengers. And they used to start by saying, "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the most boring ride in the park." If you looked to your left, you would have seen the Indian village, except that our general manager, Ed McHale, moved it to the train ride. So they got bored and came over and robbed us one day and got in big trouble for it. But it went over so well that the park decided to hire actors. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of stories, because quite honestly, the way we portrayed Native Americans back then wasn't all that good. But we did have one guy that called himself Running Bear, B-A-R-E, and he was great at vaudeville type stuff. He was slapstick all the way. We had people coming back 3 and 4 times to ride the train just because of Running Bear. In the second year, we had people that robbed the train. And occasionally, to give the actors a break, our assistant general manager, Denny Spiegel, who you may have heard of, he now has International Theme Park Services, he would dress up the front office staff. And he'd come out and he would give the actors a break. Well, one day we got wind of that, and I stopped back where the water park is today, and I told the crowd what was going on. And when we got to Denny, he came running out and said, "Stop the train," and the train went right on. And 400 people waved and said, "Hi, Mr. Spiegel." It was 30 years before I got to see Denny again and tell him who did that to her. And then there's one personal one that I gotta tell you about. They used to have a girl by the name of Miss Jessica. She was a down east girl going out west and started in life, and she was riding the train. And when the bandits got a hold of her, they would grab her and throw her over their shoulder and carry her into the cabin. And I said, "I've got the wrong job." Well, one of the gals that played that part was one of the prettiest gals I've ever met in my life. They had her dressed up in this horrible calico outfit that she hated and everyone else hated, and they used to tease her about it. And one day, she was getting a little irritated with that, so, good nerdy kid, here, I'm going to make some points with this lady. And I walked over and I said, "Susan, don't you listen to these people. I think you look just fine without that dress." 5 years later, I was driving down the interstate late at night, half asleep, and all of a sudden the radio blares out, "Tonight, Miss Susan Perkins of Middletown, Ohio was named Miss America." So I can always say I made a total fool of myself with Miss America. If you have kids or grandkids, encourage them to work at an amusement park. Because this was the best summer of my life up here in 72. I can tell you, this is the place I went from being a boy to a man. I was a nerdy kid that did not like talking to people, and before the summer was over, I was talking to a lot of people. I had 5 different kinds of waves when the train would cross the platform. I had the little kid wave, I had the old folks wave, and then I had the wave for that kid that said, "I'm a teenager and I'm too cool to wave back at you." And I just loved working with people. The second thing was, the girls never paid any attention to me. I was 6'3" and 130 pounds and skinny as a rail with big ears. But when I put on those overalls, it was like putting on a Superman outfit, and something changed that summer. And I had one girl on the ride that used to grab my lunch and run ahead to the break area and set up my food for me ahead of time. And I had another that people tried to encourage me to ask out, and I wish I had now because she was a member of one of the most prominent families in Cincinnati. But the thing that really changed me that year is one that's hard to share. I was in my dream job. I was loving what I was doing. It's what I'd always dreamed of all my life. And I was in the engine house one day, polishing the brass on the locomotive, and I saw Don Palmer, who was our head of operations, and his assistant Bill Reed coming down the track. And I wondered what they were up to. And they walked into the engine house and they said, "Grab your lunchbox and follow us." And they walked me out of the park. And my dream job was over. Because Don was a little bit on the brash side, and I didn't get along with him, and I've been talking behind his back. Even though I've been warned about that, I did it anyway. And I had been fired from my dream job. And I had an hour drive back to Dayton with tears in my eyes, trying to figure out how I was going to explain it to my parents. Well, they weren't home, and while I was sitting in the backyard trying to figure it out, the phone rang. And it was Don, and he was not nice. He just said, "Be in my office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." When I got there, Bill Reed was there, Don was there, Lou Brown, our engineer for the railroad, was there, grandfather was a 65-year-old guy. And Bill said, "Lou came to us and said you were the best worker we've ever had. He wants you back. How can we work that out?" And by 9 o'clock, I was back on the engines and spent a year and a half at the park. Sadly, I learned not too many years ago that Don Palmer had died at a young age, and one of my great regrets in life is that I never got to write to him and thank him for firing me that day, because it was one of the best lessons I've ever had. Today, I sit on the State of Ohio Board of Trustees for the Methodist Church. I've been on the Chamber of Commerce. Up until I retired, I talked to 8,000 people on a regular basis. None of that would have ever happened without Kings Island. This place gave me a life. It turned me from a boy to a man. And I am proud of this place to this day. Thank you.